is an amazing series of tunnels and roads, basically, that are shielded from American bombers, because they are in neighboring Cambodia. But Nixon escalates the war to neighboring Cambodia. Now, once that is found out, and it doesn't take long for in the days of the media, right? Vietnam is kind of like the first living room war. It gets broadcast on the news that there were airstrikes against Cambodia, which is a country not doing anything wrong necessarily. They just happen to have these tunnels. A huge protest breaks out at a university in Ohio called Kent State, and this is a very sad event. Basically what happens is that the protests get very violent, and the police and the National Guard even, they kill 4 college students, and you see one of them laying right there. And out of all the anti-war protests, that's the one that many people point to and say, wow, that the government totally went too far right there. Obviously, one life to lose is enough, but 4 college students lose their lives. When they took a poll, the media, this is also disturbing. They took a poll of the media, or the media did, of just regular Americans about, well, were the students right to demonstrate in the first place? And overwhelmingly, many of the American citizens said no, they were not right. The poll came on the side of the police officers and the law enforcement. It's very sad. It reminds me of what's going on, now in Baltimore, which is really crazy. I hope it doesn't come to this. I would hope not. But this kind of thing can happen. It has happened. Probably will continue to happen anytime there's a passionate whatever movement. But certainly this was a tremendous event, and probably did a little bit to discredit Nixon in doing what he was supposed to be doing, which is bringing peace with honor, right? Well, as Vietnamization increases, President Nixon and the United States, the worst possible thing will happen. The Vietnamese will lose the war against the North Vietnamese communist forces, and basically by 1975, the capital, Saigon, falls. That picture right there is the very last, this right here, this is the very last people from the United States Embassy being ferried off one of the top buildings, because they don't show you the whole picture. Underneath here is a ton of communist soldiers, that have taken over the rest of the city. So this is a very famous picture of sort of like Americans for the last time leaving Vietnam. It's 1975. And ironically, 20 years later, Nike will be setting up shops in Vietnam. So will other companies making your goods that you guys might buy, which is kind of disturbing when you think about it. So, what was all the cost of this? America lost 58,000 lives in Vietnam. Countless people were injured. Lives were destroyed. It cost about $1.6 billion, which for the time was a lot of money, still is. So basically, you can look at Vietnam in 2 ways. You can say, well, it was a wasted war and it was a waste of time because it was a war that we couldn't win. Or you could say maybe it was an investment. I don't know how you would argue that. To me personally, it seemed like not a tremendously great idea. And the dangers of fighting a war that's undeclared. And that's what it was. Well, that brings us to China a little bit. So, as we're starting to Vietnamize Vietnam and putting the troops and bringing the troops back. It's part of a larger foreign policy strategy. The larger foreign policy strategy is something called détente. Okay, it's a funny word. It's spelled D-E-T-E-N-T-E. Détente. It's in your book. It basically means a thawing of tensions, because the Cold War was so tense, right? And so making it less tense. And one of the things that the U.S. government was going to do is to make the Cold War less tense is to make a relationship with China. Okay, now, here's why President Nixon wanted to do that. There's a couple of reasons. First, China and Russia don't get along. Okay? Ever since China became communist back in 1949, the Russians have always looked at China kind of as a little brother, and they've treated them like that. They're like, we want you to do things the way we want you to do them. You know? China never went along with that. China said, we're going to do communism our own way. And if you guys don't like it, tough. In fact, during the 1960s, China and Russia actually fought against each other in little border skirmishes. There was a series of them throughout the 1960s. So what Nixon wanted to do is he wanted to go to China and have the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Leonid Brezhnev, he wanted him like sweating in his sleep, saying, what the heck is Richard Nixon doing in China? What are they talking about? He wanted the Russians to worry about the relationship that we were going to start cultivating in China. There was a sense with the Vietnam War, and this is reason two, there was a sense with the Vietnam War that we were devoting too many resources to fighting communism around the world, and we simply needed to scale back our military involvement. And maybe a way to do that is to make a partnership, with communist nations. Was Nixon an anti-communist? Yes. Did he hate communism? Yes. He saw the value in going to China, visiting with the Chinese, creating a relationship, which, reason number three, and perhaps he was a forward thinker. Where's most of your stuff made, guys? Okay, it all starts there. I guarantee you somebody in his administration was telling him, look, make a relationship with China because they're the future. They have the most people. If you start that relationship now, perhaps it will pay dividends for the American economy in the future. So there's like a number of reasons why America wants to do that and send Nixon to China. And Nixon did it great. He got the photo opportunities on the Great Wall, did all that kind of stuff. And that China visit, it eventually nowadays is paying dividends for the United States. Well, he's also going to do the same thing with the Russians. He's going to be the first U.S. president, the first sitting U.S. president to visit Russia. So he visits China and Russia in his term. It's like, wow, this guy really has it going on. Nixon was like the Jedi Knight of foreign policy. You know what I mean? Like, just the Force was with him. I don't know. He was awesome. He could go visit with anybody, even our most bitter enemies, and make deals with them. He wanted to go to the Soviet Union to visit with them, to scale back the Cold War and to sign a treaty, a very important treaty called SALT I. SALT means Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. Limitations. He's talking, what they're doing is making a limit on how many nuclear weapons they're going to have. Okay? He also wanted to make that treaty with the Russians to make China sweat a little bit too. Like, he wanted to play both sides because, again, China and Russia don't get along. you can be friends with one, maybe you can make the other mad. If you can make friends with the other, maybe you can make the other mad. He wanted to exploit that tension. He was a genius. I mean, honestly. Now, at foreign policy, though, domestic policy, not so much. He had some problems. He had some problems anyway, which we'll get into. But foreign policy-wise, he's trying to create relationships. It's all about détente, thawing of tensions, making the tensions less. And the 70s is all about that. Until Reagan comes along on a big white horse and says, the Soviet Union is the evil empire and we will defeat you by building missiles in outer space, even with a new system called Star Wars that doesn't exist. It never existed. So, the election of 1972 was a pretty whopping landslide. It's kind of like what happened to the LA Lakers this season in every game. They just got killed. And that's my team, so I can talk about them. But basically, the Democrats didn't really stand a chance. They put up an anti-war candidate named George McGovern. And you can tell George McGovern just really had no hope. Just hopeless. And this is one of the last elections in which it's almost all red. Reagan's going to do the same thing. Now keep this under your hat here, because when we come back to this, just do a little snapshot in your mind about how Republican the country is at this point. Who votes for Nixon? Because when we get to the Watergate scandal, we'll come back to this. Okay. One of the things happening in the 1970s, in the early 70s, and probably one reason why the United States was interested in trying to slow the Cold War down a little bit, is we did have a series of domestic economic issues. One of them had to do with inflation. Okay? Inflation is when prices do what? Increase, right? And in the 70s, they're increasing because of one thing. The evil oil exploiting countries of OPEC. No, I'm just kidding. Maybe not evil. But what's starting to happen is it has to do a little bit with the Cold War, okay? OPEC means Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So it's basically a big bunch of countries throughout the world that their business is exporting oil, right? Do you guys know which country that most of our oil comes from? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia provides like a ton of oil to the rest of the world. They're just sitting on like a giant oil patch, basically. Well, what's happening in the 70s, if you can make some connections with this, try to hang with me. Over in the Middle East, you have Israel, okay? Israel is a country that was created in 1948 to basically house Jewish folks, okay? The United Nations created Israel so that Jewish people would have a homeland, right? Because you remember what happened to Jews in World War II, right? The Holocaust. This is a movement that's been trying to happen for a long time. The problem is that there was always people that always lived in that land already. Those are called the Palestinians. Okay? Are you with me? All right, so the United States supports Israel in its life to try to defend it against the Palestinians, as well as other neighbors that are around Israel that don't like the fact that a Jewish state is in the middle of their, I guess, Muslim world. Countries like Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, they don't like Israel there, and the United States is supporting them. Once Israel becomes an actual state, right after they become an actual nation, war breaks out. Throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there's a series of wars and border clashes between Israel and its neighbors.